Welcome to Sivako, the road to Avatar. I am Shaun Alexander, and I will be your guide to the world of Pandora and beyond. And today, I have a very special guest with me. Special guest, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Matt Packer, and I'm a freelance business and finance writer and avatar geek. And I don't think anything else about me is particularly important at this stage.
Look, it's all based on like how Avatar geeky you are at this point now, isn't it?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, yeah. That's what it all
So,
comes down to.
yeah, exactly. That's the most important thing, and that's the reason we sort of had a sort of discussion, and you wanted to come on the podcast as well.
Yep, yep. I mean, I've been doing other bits of Avatar fanship lately, in the sense that I've been doing interviews for Kelutral, the language, the Navi language dudes, and they asked me to do interviews with some of their members and some of their associates. So I've done three of those. I've got there two of them are out there, and one of them's coming up at some point.
Very exciting. I'll make sure to put some links into the show notes so people can have a little gander at that. So, as I do with all my guests, I have a few questions for you, and the first of which is, when did you first see Avatar?
I first saw Avatar in, I think it was mid-January of 2010. I couldn't see it straight away because I had a really busy work period going up to the Christmas, and then a really busy Christmas, and then a really busy work period right after Christmas. So I kind of, didn't get around to it as quickly as I wanted to. But I was psyched about it. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was absolutely, buzzing about it and buzzing about seeing it. Um, and I saw it at. I finally got around to it at my local View multiplex, and it was a fairly, sort of a mid-size auditorium, with a standard size screen, and it was in 3D. I was in the second row, and it was, total head removal for 3 hours. So, the first, I think by that stage it was really kind of taking off. There were like loads of news reports about how well it was doing box office wise. So I was kind of catching it when it was really starting to, turn into a proper rocket ship. And the first thing that I really remember, when I kind of think back to that first time I saw it, was that I've got no memory of there being any frame to the screen, if that makes sense. I mean, I just felt like I was kind of in it, you know. And it happened very that happened that sort of psychological, you know, sort of, I don't know, kind of boundary crossing or whatever it was, that happened very very quickly. It was in literally the first 30 seconds of the film. I just thought, wow, I'm in this thing.
I've got a feeling like the second row probably helps with that as well,
Yeah,
in
yeah.
terms of like you're if I'm right in thinking most second rows are tilted back slightly so you can get the whole screen in your
Yeah,
vision, and
yeah,
basically nothing else is you're only looking at screen. There's no walls, no lights. It's
yeah,
sort of like I've always used to see like an exit light.
yep.
But there's been a few times where I've sat so close where it is just like sensory overload. I think I did it for Force Awakens, and that really
Right.
helped.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, if you can't go and see a movie on an enormous screen, then obviously the second row is a pretty good place to be. So yeah, it was phenomenal. Yeah, it was just the emotional roller coaster, and the euphoria. I just found the whole experience completely. I mean, it's still to this day. The first time I saw Avatar is still to this day my favorite experience of being in a movie theater. It was just completely overwhelming on every level, really.
Awesome. I was going to actually ask, because you saw it a little bit later, you
Yeah,
saw about like a month after it had released.
yeah.
What was it like in terms of like how many people were in the screen? Do you remember?
It's difficult to say because like once I got into this thing, I could barely even remember my own name. You know, but I think it was sort of. it was reasonably well attended. But there was a whole bunch going on behind me that I didn't really care about. It was I was kind of detached from reality after a certain time. So yeah, it was an interesting time to see it, actually, because yeah, it had been out for about a month, and then you do have that kind of thought in the back of your mind of, oh, this is quite interesting. I'm seeing all these news reports indicating that Jim Cameron has gone and done it again, and but there is this thing in the back of your mind going, is it really up to all that? And then you sort of sit down in front of the thing and you go, yep.
Yeah, don't bet against him anymore. Honestly, I feel like I repeat that
Yeah,
so often.
tis a silly thing to do.
Yeah. So, is there a particular moment from the film that stands out to you still?
Gosh, I mean, that's a crowded field. I really love the part where Jake first wakes up in his avatar body, and I'm going to be going into that a little bit in some of the stuff I've got to say later. But his first baby step into the world that he decides that he really belongs in, and that's it's a really kind of a joyful moment. And when he kind of springs out of the lab and he's um, running over the kind of local, they've got that kind of local garden area, and it's really you can kind of feel that rush of adrenaline that he's feeling.
Yeah, definitely, and I think that's might be the most chosen moment right now. I'll have to
Right.
start keeping a tally. I'm gonna have to go back over my episodes and see what the tally looks like.
Yeah, yeah,
But I can't blame anyone. That is a fantastic moment, and obviously it is because it's that first introduction into sort of the of what it's like being in that avatar
yeah.
body.
Yeah, and it's where you get it's the first kind of hint of the perception flip that the film pulls as well, because it initially introduces you to Pandora as a kind of a threatening place, and I mean, when the shuttle first comes down to Hell's Gate, everything is kind of in this washed out color palette. Everything looks really grey, and you've got Quaritch delivering his address and giving everybody the heebie-jeebies about how nasty this this world is, um, and 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 then this is your first kind of trip into what Pandora is actually like if you try and experience it from the people who live there and love it. And and I love that bit where he bites into that fruit. Grace chucks him that fruit, and he bites into it, and all the juice kind of runs down his chin and everything, and it's like so visceral. And there's something kind of, I don't know, there's something kind of mythic about that. So he's kind of taking this kind of big juicy bite of his new life.
Mm. That's a great way to put it. I love that. And finally, what is your excitement level for The Way of Water?
Oh goodness. It's I've ever since I walked out of that first showing that I ever saw of Avatar, I mean, that my mind kind of raced away in the aftermath of watching the film for the first time, thinking about all the things that they could do with that world, and all of the directions they could go in. What kind of new environments we could see, and I was my mind was racing with thoughts about, well, what, surely Jake and Neytiri are going to have kids and all of this sort of stuff. And now we've heard little bits of advanced publicity saying, oh, yeah, we're going to go here, and yes, Jake and Neytiri do have kids, and they look like this, and da da da. And it's just, I think it's going to be like a kind of a sense of like a homecoming in a way. I've never been so hyped for a film ever, as I am about The Way of Water. There's just nothing even gets close to the hype levels that I've got and have had for the past 13 years.
I think it's interesting because obviously, with the 13-year gap as well, it is sort of like the first time like a generation are experiencing this sort of like, oh, we had it the first time round, and now we're we're getting our legacy sequel of sorts in a way.
Yeah,
And because obviously people, there was a generation who have had that with their Star Wars or their various other various other medias, but
yeah,
I feel like Avatar's the first example, certainly for a new generation who are experiencing that.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting because the first one had, I mean, Jim Cameron is quite, quite famously said that the first one had an 8 to 80 audience range, and that means that there's actually a huge pool out there of people who will be very, very curious about this. And I think the fact that they've waited 13 years just makes it more special. I mean, it's interesting. I saw that when the Way of Water comes out, the gap between Avatar and the Way of Water will be only 3 years shorter than the gap between the Return of the Jedi and the Phantom Menace. You know, so it's interesting that that sometimes it's good to let things subside for a little bit. But I really do like the idea that we're going to get one every 2 years.
I spoke about this on a previous episode about how it feels like Avatar, the first one, the one in '09, felt like it was the sort of prequel, like the setup. And this means that Way of Water onwards is all the juicy stuff that we're actually waiting for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the great thing about it is that the Avatar '09 has done an awful lot of groundwork, and there's going to be a lot of things that the sequels aren't necessarily going to have to bother with in terms of explaining. That it's almost like you can kind of kick straight into a story, and I'm fascinated by how large the story is going to be. I'm very intrigued about that. I'm very intrigued about the idea that we've got a family type situation. I'm wondering whether it's going to be a little bit like the Starks in Game of Thrones. Whether they're all going to get split up and have their own kind of journeys. It's just so exciting. And I really like the idea that it's gonna, well, certainly the Way of Water and Avatar 3 are both, they're both going to have Jim Cameron's creative imprint on them. We're not there's obviously said that he might not do 4 and 5, but I get the feeling that he will. And I'm fascinated by that as a kind of, it's kind of an authorial project. It's something that he's doing. I always thought that the first one was a kind of a passion project, and it's something that it looks and feels and behaves like the work of someone who really, really cared about what he was doing and was really, really into it. And if we're going to get that, times two, certainly with the Way of Water and Avatar 3, and then potentially again with 4 and 5, it's going to stand as a magnum opus. I really do believe that, and I mean that kind of it's almost if he does hand over the reins for 4 and 5, I guess that he will be keeping a very sort of tight watch on whoever he gets to direct those ones if he chooses to kind of pass on the reins. So I think that yeah, regardless of whether he does 4 and 5 or passes them on, I think that it will be his magnum opus. That's really exciting.
It really is. I feel like we're ready for this new Jim Cameron era,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I think people have been sort of clamoring for it as well,
yeah,
based on what we've had in terms of blockbuster cinema in the recent years.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think he'll end up doing 4.
I can't see him not.
Yeah, I mean, he was really enthusiastic. If you read the Empire interview, he was hyper enthusiastic about that one. Said that it's it's a real corker, and I think it's the sort of thing he just won't be able to help himself.
And the thing is, if he does four, why wouldn't he do
Why would he?
five?
Why would he hand over 5? That's
Yeah,
exactly
it
it.
would
I
seem a
mean,
little rude not to at that point.
yeah, yeah. It would just be bizarre, you know. So yeah, I hope he stays the whole course. It would be fascinating, and also, what better way to kind of cuss down the detractors who've been mithering on for the best part of a decade, than to to do all four of the sequels, and then have them all go to huge levels of success.
And it's interesting that you're talking about detractors because one of the topic we're actually talking about today is about an influence of avatars. And now, obviously, Avatar has a lot of influences that people talk about, and people, one of the main things that people use as a detraction of Avatar is that it is too much like similar certain films. The ones that are often cited are the ones like Pocahontas, Ferngully, and Dances with Wolves. We are, however, talking about a different film, which you brought to me as a good example of something he's taken advantage of, taken some inspiration from. And yeah, would you like to introduce the film we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. Yeah. Well, what I'm going to deliver is it's sort of in two parts, I guess. So the main meat of the discussion is going to be about the Emerald Forest, which is a 1985 film by John Boorman, and it's absolutely beautiful to look at. And it's a story about the effects of heavy industry on indigenous peoples. And what I'm going to do first of all, shall I kind of go into the because I've got pages and pages of stuff to to expound. um, I think maybe what I'll do is I'll start with the whole notion of James Cameron as an artist who is influenced by stuff. Cool. Yeah. So I think probably the best place to start with this, because this is in, I guess it's almost in three parts really. So what I'd first like to talk about is James Cameron as an artist who is influenced by stuff, and then go into some of the influences that have contributed to Avatar, and then go into much more depth about the Emerald Forest. So to take those in turn, yes, James Cameron is an artist who is influenced by stuff. That's a fact. Um, I mean, if you look at the Terminator, it's fairly well known that Cameron drew on influences ranging from Halloween and old episodes of The Outer Limits, to Walter Hill's The Driver, with Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, inspiring the future war scenes. If you look at Aliens, the big story here is that Cameron gave every member of the cast a copy of Robert A. Heinlein's military science fiction novel Starship Troopers. And Aliens is perfectly readable as a kind of an unofficial adaptation of that book years before the brilliant Paul Verhoeven take, as well as an exercise in following the template of Ridley Scott's Alien to the letter, pretty much, right down to, Ripley having to bail out of a structure that's about to explode in the final stretch. Then, if you go on to the Abyss, there's a lot of close encounters in there, mashed up with a kind of a Tom Clancy style techno thriller, with Jim taking a leaf out of the Stargate sequence from 2001 as Ed Harris's character Bud Brigman enters the aliens' underwater lair. There's a fair bit of ET floating around in that particular chunk of the film too. If we get on to Terminator 2 Judgment Day, what really stands out here is that T2 is a very close revisitation of the plot template from T1. Essentially, it's a kind of a lavish, big budget remake of the first film, much in the same way that Aliens follows Alien, with all the elements established in T1 basically amped up. With the notable exception of the motel room love scene, which I assume didn't, something like that didn't make it through for reasons of wanting to reach a younger audience. Then True Lies is an outright remake. And what happened here was that Arnold Schwarzenegger had seen and was incredibly impressed by the French espionage comedy La Totale, and he brought it to Cameron and said, I think we can do something with this, or I think we can do something with this. and Jim completely went for it. And I've also read that Cameron was partially inspired by the Coens in his decision to be a bit more overtly stylized with his camera. Then we go on to Titanic, and I'd say that similar rules apply in the sense that Titanic was heavily inspired by the 1958 Roy Ward Baker film A Night to Remember, which I mean, and so if not an outright remake, Titanic is certainly a kind of a big budget, lavish exercise in channeling the sorts of beats and emotional resonances that made A Night to Remember work. Um, and then, of course, we've got loads of influence from The Shining coming in when the ship starts to collapse. And we've got the kind of the Kate and Leo charging down flooded, collapsing corridors and all that sort of stuff. So what all of this demonstrates is that James Cameron is basically a sponge. For the most part, he utilizes his influences in an extremely brazen, extremely obvious, and yet extremely unabashed fashion. But having said that, I think it's equally obvious and absolutely clear that once he's harnessed these influences and he's kind of filtered them through the prism of his own sensibilities and stylistic inflections and his worldview and his personal obsessions and fascinations, what comes out of the production line on the other end is 100% recognizably the work of James Cameron. So all of the various, sort of traits and textures that comprise his authorial imprint, in the end, govern and inform how his influences are absorbed and digested and molded into something new. So now we get into Avatar. And it doesn't take an awful lot of digging around in this film to see that its scheme of influences is an order of magnitude greater than anything you see in Jim's previous films. And this ties into something that I've thought about Avatar for a long, long time, which is that it's in fact an extremely complex film disguised as an extremely simple one. Um, and the three influences that obviously have been most frequently claimed for Avatar, often in an unkind or disparaging way, are Fern Gully and Pocahontas, and most significantly of all, Dances with Wolves. And of course, there are elements and sort of tones from each of those in Cameron's film. But when you really lift up the rug and examine the film in detail, you find very quickly that it's teeming with influences that collectively impart a very kind of specific framework of meanings. Um, and I thought it'd be cool exercise to just sort of tease out from the film a kind of a rundown of those multiple influences, to give people an idea of how the film's narrative, thematic, and polemical engines work. So first and foremost, I'd say Aliens looms very large. Avatar is essentially an inverted Aliens, which asks and answers the question: what if we gave the xenomorphs a language and culture, and made them defenders of the natural world, and encouraged the audience to see the story from their perspective? Maybe we wouldn't be so keen, perhaps, to blow them away, or seen them be blown away. That's really the kind of I think Aliens is an enormous uh, influence on the movie. Then we've got Silent Running, Douglas Trumbull's 1972 ecological science fiction film about a botanist on a spacecraft containing Earth's last remaining plots of forest in a set of geodesic domes. And the lead character, Freeman Lowell, played by Bruce Dern, is very much a kind of a forerunner of Grace Augustine, I would say. Also on environmental turf, Studio Ghibli's Nausicaa, Valley of the Wind, and Princess Mononoke, which, as well as being science fiction and fantasy adventures, are environmental or ecological fables or message movies. Leading on from Studio Ghibli, we have literally any other anime in the mech genre.
He loves a mech suit,
He loves the
honestly.
mech stuff. He absolutely loves the mech stuff. I swear that once upon a time I read an interview where he talked about how the bridge sequence in True Lies, which is amazing, was partially inspired by Pat Labor. And I think it was in a magazine interview just ages ago, and so I can't track it down on the internet because it never made it online. But you can tell that Cameron is just a major mech head, when it comes to his anime. Um, I mean, when mech is a clear, massive inspiration for Avatar's vehicle tech and the amp suits. It's kind of right through it, really. Then I'd say the novel Starship Troopers is also a key influence on Avatar as well as Aliens. And another novel that I think looms pretty large is Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, which I would kind of say is a huge background influence, especially the part of the book where Gulliver visits the land of Brobdingnag, where everything around him looks kind of like what he remembers from his own world, only it's all on this massively outsized scale. Just as Pandora's flora and fauna and its terrain appear to Jake. And then, obviously you've got cyberpunk, most specifically Total Recall and The Matrix. That idea of using technology to jack into other experiences, except instead of jacking into fake memories like Doug Quaid does in Total Recall, or a computer simulated world like Thomas Anderson does in The Matrix, Jake is jacking into another body that provides the enlightening experiences. And that there's I think there's also a touch of Blade Runner 2 when you look at the collector's edition, and you've got the early scenes where it kind of sets up the type of Earth that Jake came from. That's very much visually influenced by Blade Runner. King Kong is a major presence, I would say. That idea of a journey to a lush and exotic jungle environment populated with outlandish creatures. The creature effects are very strongly informed by the values of King Kong's Willis O'Brien, who essentially is the godfather of creature effects. And of course, there's an explicit King Kong reference, which is that the ship in King Kong is called the Venture, and the main space cruiser in Avatar that takes Jake to Pandora is the ISV Venture Star, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Um, then we've got Apocalypse Now, which I think is a massive visual and thematic influence on Avatar's action sequences, specifically the attack on Home Tree and the final battle. Then we're getting into Gaia theory via the writings and teachings of James Lovelock, who died recently. And Lovelock developed and postulated the concept that Earth is a self-regulating organism in its own right, that's comprised of a vast array of primary, secondary, and tertiary ecosystems that act like organs in the Earth organism. Then there's the Mars novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs, starring displaced Confederate veteran John Carter, who's spirited away to Mars while prospecting and comes into contact with a race of exceedingly tall aliens. So he's kind of a fish out of water who eventually learns to master the environment in which he's been transported. And then last but not least, we have Frankenstein. One of my favorite scenes in Avatar, which I talked about earlier, is where Jim takes a brief but powerful turn into sci-fi horror territory, and that's when we see Jake waking up in his Avatar body for the first time. And there's this sense that all may not be quite well as he rises from the gurney and knocks over medical equipment and alarms the clinicians who are around him. The whole moment plays out like a kind of a Frankenstein resurrection scene, which totally works because this avatar body lumbering around is a creature that eventually moves beyond its creator's control. So I don't think that any of that is accidental. Now, what all of this demonstrates is that Avatar is basically this giant melting pot of influences imbued with an actually quite complex web of meanings. And that's why, to me, the Dances with Wolves comparisons are so absurdly simple minded.
I like that I don't have to be the one who has to say it, because this is, as an Avatar podcast, this is the thing I hear the most is,
Yeah,
oh, but it's just Dances with Wolves, but they're blue, and
yeah,
I
yeah,
think it's such like a simple way of putting it, and it's like the most like base level. I don't want to read any
yeah.
deeper into the film.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's almost like something that people set up for themselves to prevent themselves from having to use their brains. I think that's really a kind of an issue. Yeah, I mean, yes, it is. It's an outer space riff on the idea of an outsider falling in with a tribe and becoming one with them, as seen in dances and other films such as A Man Called Horse and so on. But this is the crucial thing: the idea that the experience of watching Avatar is identical to the experience of watching Dances with Wolves is absolutely and completely preposterous.
You put it in kind of language that I've heard before.
Yeah, I mean, it is just total and utter nonsense. The films are very aesthetically different. They are very differently made, but over and above all that, I'd say that they're very, very different concerns at heart. So, to pick out that one structural element as a kind of a similarity and say that it applies across the whole of Avatar is, in my view, the height of laziness. All it tells me is that you're reasonably good at matching pairs type board games, and that's about it.
That's such a great comparison of just, oh, I've figured out, oh, this is the same as this thing, and I
Yeah, yeah, and job done.
yeah.
That's it. I don't have to think about this anymore. I don't have to think about this in any greater depth anymore. Um, and yeah, I think that to focus or fixate on the dances with wolves elements, the exclusion of all else, and think that makes you really sort of edgy and clever, is essentially to focus on the scaffolding without seeing the skyscraper. You're just missing whole huge chunks of what motivated Jim Cameron to make the film. Which brings us finally, in a roundabout kind of fashion, to John Boorman's 1985 film The Emerald Forest. Now, um, I really think that this film is the single biggest influence on the substance and the soul of Avatar. In other words, it's the influence that shaped the skyscraper rather than the scaffolding. It's an extremely lush and visually beautiful film, which should come as no surprise from the guy who made, by 1985, John Boorman had already made Point Blank, Hell in the Pacific, which is an amazing film that hardly anybody ever talks about anymore, and I just think it's scandalous. Deliverance, the delightfully strange Zardoz, and the tremendous Arthurian retelling Excalibur. And the important thing about the Emerald Forest in the context of Avatar is that it's a handy bit of evidence to have around when you hear people in a sometimes, sort of flattering way describe Avatar as pure escapism. No, it's not. I've always thought that what Avatar does so effectively is to use the language of blockbuster filmmaking as a kind of lecture platform to thrash out and work through a set of ideas about what human beings are really doing on our own world to other human beings. And the Emerald Forest is key to that. So I'm going to kind of, go through the movie pretty much from um, beginning to end, and kind of name, sort of nod every so often. I'll kind of like nod at the bits that I think have resonances to Avatar. So Borman's film concerns an American man called Bill Markham, played by Powers Booth, who's the architect and chief engineer of a hydroelectric dam project in Brazil. And he's living in a well appointed high rise in an unnamed city outside the Amazon rainforest, but close enough for commuting into it. Markham is accompanied by his wife Jean, played by Meg Foster, uh, his daughter Heather, played by Yara Vano, and 7-year-old son Tommy, played at that age by William Rodriguez. And we open with a helicopter shot that shows us where the city is situated in relation to the forest, and in short order, that gives way to another chopper shot of the family snaking into the jungle in their car on a dusty road of red earth. We then cut to a car-mounted shot, putting us in the position of the family pulling into a large and immediately, obviously man-made clearing, completely denuded of foliage and smoothed over. So the whole area feels like a pit of red earth, but it's been squared off all around the edges, and the overlooking jungle slopes have been stripped bare, we're told in anticipation of an urban development that will live next door to the massive dam intended for the site. And the whole panorama feels like a violation of the natural environment. And where once there were trees, there are bright yellow bulldozers toing and froing, surrounded by workers in hard hats. And if this is starting to remind you of the enormous open cast mine gouged into the surface of Pandora that we see when Jake arrives there early in the first act of Avatar, feel free to award yourself several points. So this is the counter paradise that Markham and his company have created, and bulldozers basically pushing and digging up trees and ripping them down with chains all around him and his family. Young Tommy is very excited by the spectacle, um, and in a note of what will prove to be extremely bitter irony, Markham nods to one of the bulldozers and tells his son, "One of these days, when you get a little older, I'll teach you how to drive one of those." Um, Now, as the family are having a picnic during a work break, Tommy strays into the very edge of the jungle and encounters silent members of an indigenous tribe, who we later find out are called the Invisible People. Bill follows after him, and as he heads into the foliage, a brightly fletched arrow thuds into a tree trunk right next to him, signaling the moment when Tommy disappears. And if that arrow reminds you of the brightly coloured arrows protruding from the wheel of a mining vehicle when Jake rolls into Hell's Gate in Avatar, award yourself several more points. Um, we cut to the whole family and a group of workers searching for Tommy, and as Bill makes it to the top of a ridge, the camera cranes up for a reveal of the vast expanse of jungle into which we know Tommy has now vanished. We then pick things up 10 years later, and the first thing that we see is that Markham's dam is nearing completion and standing astride the river like a concrete colossus. And here, Borman's helicopter camera delights in the contrast between this soulless grey edifice and the lush, verdant forest in the background. And I think there's a clear aesthetic link here with how Cameron visualizes Hell's Gate, nestled within the jungle of Pandora. Back at the Markham's apartment in the city, we find that Bill and Jean have been searching for Tommy all of this time, and almost like scientists, have built up an extensive collection of tribal accoutrements and related research. In the course of this detective work, Bill has hit upon a fresh lead as to Tommy's whereabouts, and he teams up with an incredibly cocky and facetious photographer for what resembles an Apocalypse Now style river journey into the mysterious heart of tribal territory. And it's at this point that we cut right inside the deep jungle to find that a young lad called Tommy is now a 100% fully naturalized member of the Invisible People. He's about 17 years old, so he's on the threshold of manhood. He speaks exclusively in the tribe's language, and he's entirely steeped in its customs and traditions. So, not long after we pick up Tommy's thread, he undergoes a ritualistic ceremony for becoming a man, which requires him firstly to spend a whole night being covered in fire ants, and secondly to inhale an extremely powerful psychoactive substance. And as a result of that dose, he mentally and imaginatively embarks on a vision quest, which I guess is a kind of a posh phrase for trip, in which he pictures himself as, or projects himself into, an eagle soaring over the forest. So it's this idea of mastery that he's absolutely kicked in as a senior member of the tribe and is to some extent part of the forest too. Now, extremely committed Avatar fans who've leached every bit of content off the collector's edition Blu-ray like a bunch of vampires, and I know you're out there. Uh, will
Guilty.
be yeah, likewise. Will be aware that one of the most startling, or arguably the most startling, of the deleted scenes is the one known as Dream Hunt, which chronologically was meant to slot into the film after Neytiri paints Jake's body as part of his ceremony for becoming one with the Omaticaya. And what basically happens is that Jake inhales a smoke that's blown towards him from some kind of pipe, I think by Moat. The scene's not fully rendered, but I'm pretty sure it's Moat. And then he eats a bioluminescent worm and then is stung twice by a scorpion-like creature that I think is brandished by Etukan. So he's, nicely set up for this triple whammy of absolute, psychoactive mayhem. And what really fascinates me about this is that if this scene had made it through, we'd have had this, huge family-friendly sci-fi blockbuster where halfway through the hero has a massive drug-induced hallucination and the film turns into a Tool video for 5 minutes, which is all completely tantalizing. But what happens is that Jake goes on a vision quest and has a vision or precognition of the Toruk, which he later commandeers in spectacular fashion. Now, when I discovered this scene, it basically sealed the deal for me that Avatar's soul and substance are rooted in the Emerald Forest. It was just completely undeniable, and it actually made me appreciate both films even more. It's a great influence to pick, I think, and I'm surprised Boorman's film, isn't more influential because it really deserves to be. So back to the Emerald Forest. After his vision quest, Tommy pledges himself to a young tribeswoman called Kachiri, setting up the film's core romantic plot. And obviously, one can't help but wonder at the similarity of her name to that of a certain Pandoran princess. Elsewhere in the jungle that night, Markham and his photographer friend set off a bunch of flares and fireworks to attract the attention of local forest dwellers, and are promptly surrounded and marched off by a more aggressive rival tribe to the Invisible People called the Fierce People, led by the fearsome chief Jakari, who turn out to be cannibals. Relations very quickly go south, and as the photographer is attacked, Markham shoots one of the Fierce People dead. Jakari gives Markham a head start to run for his life, and then the Fierce People begin to hunt him down. And at this point, we have a lengthy scene of Markham running till dawn, essentially, through the forest alone and inexperienced. And I'd say that scene has a clear tonal link with Jake's first night in the Pandoran rainforest in Avatar. And that's after he's run off from the Thanator and got detached from the rest of the group that he was with. Uh, and that gives way to what I think is the most powerful scene in the film. Um, Completely exhausted, Markham arrives at a lagoon where Tommy has gone foraging, and the two clap eyes on each other for the first time in a decade. And Boorman plays the moment superbly, really teasing it out as father and son gaze at each other with initial incomprehension that slowly kind of, it turns to realization. And there's an interesting element of this scene that proves pretty conclusively to me that the Emerald Forest has also had an influence on Avatar: The Way of Water. So there's a brilliant image of Tommy staring at Markham with bow at the ready behind a cascading waterfall, which uh, that image was used on a number of poster designs for the Emerald Forest. It's very striking. And there's an eerie connection there with the image in The Way of Water's trailer of the new character Spider pulling back on his bow while facing down some intruders to the Pandoran forest. It's an absolutely unmistakable likeness there, which shows just how much Cameron admires Boorman's film. So after this electrifying moment, when father and son are reunited, Markham is shot in the arm with a Fierce People arrow, and Tommy guides him to safety, bringing him to his village following a spectacular pursuit through Whitewater Rapids. There's a clear tonal link there with Jake's escape from the Thanator in Avatar. Um, During the pursuit, Jakari captures Markham's machine gun, which is an important point. Um, At the Invisible People's village, Markham immediately falls very ill from poison in his arrow wound, and the tribe help him to rehabilitate while he's on. And the tribe help him to rehabilitate. While he's on the mend, Tommy is formally joined with Kachiri in a marriage ceremony. And while all of this is going on, the Fierce People cut a deal with the owner of a brothel on a workers' compound linked to the dam project, promising to bring the workers tribal women in exchange for ammunition for Jakari's captured gun. Back at the village, Markham shows his respect to the Invisible People by taking their psychoactive. He's instantly plunged into his own vision quest, and while he's hallucinating, the tribe carry him away from the village and deposit him on the edge of a construction site somewhere near the dam, where he's found by a bulldozer and a group of workers. While this was an action that the Invisible People took for their own protection, when they return to the village, they find it burned, its elders dead, and its women gone, including Tommy's beloved Kachiri. Following a ceremony to mourn the dead, the Invisible People head off to track the women through the forest, And on the way, they come across a massive man-made clearing with the almost complete dam lurking ominously in the background. They finally realise just how far the outsiders have encroached on their territory. And there's huge resonance there with the scene in Avatar when Jake and Neytiri witness a large clearing in the Pandoran forest the morning after they've made love. Once the invisible people reach the brothel at the workers' compound, they get into a very one-sided fight with the fierce people, during which Tommy's adoptive father, Chief Wundy, is fatally wounded. And this, of course, is all thanks to Jacari's captured gun. At daybreak, Tommy heads out of the forest and strikes out for the city by rowing boat with the aim of enlisting Markham's help, which he does by climbing up the outside of the family's high rise and letting himself in. Interestingly, he susses out the apartment's location by taking a psychoactive substance in a local slum and going on another vision quest. At the apartment, he finally has an emotional reunion with his mother. At night, Markham returns to the forest in a jeep with Tommy and a small group of armed men heading for the workers' compound, where the invisible people's women are now being pimped. In a firefight at the brothel with assorted workers and members of the fierce people, Tommy and Markham free the women. At dawn, Markham realizes that Tommy belongs with the invisible people in the forest, and in a huge change of heart, and this just goes to show how his character has kind of completely moved on. Markham resolves to blow up the dam, but Tommy tells him that the power of nature could bring it down. After some toing and froing on this, Markham and Tommy hug, and Markham bids his son farewell. Later, at the Invisible People's village, Tommy is anointed as the tribe's leader. And then we're on to the spectacular climax. So at night, Tommy goes on another psychoactives fueled vision quest, and the forest is hit by a torrential storm. There's a bit of ambiguity around this in the sense that the film invites us to make up our own minds as to whether Tommy's hallucination has summoned the storm or whether it's a coincidence. But over at the dam, Markham orders an evacuation, citing dangerous water levels. And once everyone's gone, he plants a series of explosives along a tunnel in the structure's wall. And at the very point he's about to press the button on his bomb trigger, a lightning strike shears off part of a crane. And when it comes to land, it snaps the wire connecting the trigger to the bombs. But then Markham hears a deep rumble and looks on as a huge river flood smashes through the dam, completely destroying it. So Tommy was right after all, and the power of nature had what it took to bring the dam down. I would definitely say that the cleansing and cathartic scenes of the workers being evacuated and the dam being destroyed share a pretty direct kinship with the scenes near the end of Avatar when the RDA Mining Corporation is defeated and the humans are sent packing. The film ends with Tommy and his tribe playing in a rock pool near the village, which has a lot of resonance actually with the Avatar deleted scene New Life, where we see the Omaticaya at play in a Pandoran lagoon enjoying a life of peace, with Jake stroking Neytiri's pregnant belly. However, just before the Emerald Forest's end credits roll, it leaves us with the following caption. The rainforests of the Amazon are disappearing at a rate of 5,000 acres per day. 4 million Indians once lived there, 120,000 remain. A few tribes have never had contact with the outside world. They still know what we have forgotten. So, yeah, I mean, what I hope people have gathered from that is that The Emerald Forest is a pretty powerful film. And, I'd suggest that Jake Sully in Avatar is almost like, what would happen if you took Tommy and Markham and combined them into the same character. Tommy and Markham appear to represent the two sides of Jake's persona. So we have the kind of company man on the one hand and the free spirit on the other. And I think the Emerald Forest is, such an important reference point because it's steeped in the same kind of, righteous indignation that fuels and informs Avatar. By the end, Markham is, clearly consumed by this massive disgust, which I think includes self-disgust at how the meddling of industry has blighted the lives of the rainforest's indigenous population and played the invisible people and fierce people off against each other. And, when you look at Avatar, a very similar sense of disgust and righteous indignation is evoked all the way through the build up to execution and aftermath of the attack on Home Tree, which is presented very frankly as an act of genocide against a significantly less well resourced community. You know, I mean, you know, not wanting to put too fine a point on it, this isn't Thanos snapping his fingers and a few principal characters turning into sawdust and most of the outcome happening off screen. You know, I mean, the attack on Home Tree is right up in your face as a callous attempt to wipe out a people who are standing in the way of a prized mineral. And I guess this is why I find Avatar so compelling as a kind of platform or sandbox or perhaps even a gym for working through a bunch of issues about what human beings are really doing to other human beings. If we think about that closing caption of the Emerald Forest, well, that film was made in 1985 or released in 1985, so that's it's almost 40 years old, and we're still dealing with this sort of stuff now. And if you look back over the past 5 years or so of heavy industry's treatment of indigenous peoples, it's an absolute horror show. Um, Probably the most famous recent example was Rio Tinto's move in 2020 to blow up the Juukan Gorge Heritage Site in Western Australia, which was a set of sacred Aboriginal cave systems first used 46,000 years ago. And that was to procure a certain high quality type of iron ore. And then more recently, we had the killings in Brazil of British journalist Dom Phillips and Indigenous peoples expert Bruno Pereira, who'd been looking into what's happening to Indigenous communities in the rainforest amid the policies of the Bolsonaro regime. So, I really think that the way Avatar channels these issues and provides a space for, working them through in the guise of a sci-fi blockbuster is tremendously effective. I mean, you don't see any Marvel films doing that.
I think that's definitely something. This always comes up, and I hate to be the one who sort of sounds like I'm ragging on Marvel, because I do get enjoyment out of Marvel, but I don't get the same level that I do from something like Avatar, because it's on it's trying to do something on a different level. And I think you've described it perfectly. And your explanation for the Emerald Forest is incredible, like pointing out all these different aspects. And I want to go back to a couple of them because I think they're just so interesting. In particular, with regards to the ending, with how Tommy does his like last spirit journey to like call for the rain. I think that's so similar to Jake when he connects to the Tree of Souls and calls for Iowa to help. And yeah, then there's the arrival of nature in both films. Like
Yeah,
this
yeah,
is
yeah,
this
yeah,
is
absolutely.
literally
Yeah,
this is if this isn't a sign to be like, hey, look, nature has stepped in and done what it needs to do.
yeah, yeah, and it's. I think that's the whole message that nature is always kind of bigger than us. And if it doesn't want us around, it'll tell us. you know, I think it's obviously that you've got Borman uses a kind of a giant river flood, and Cameron goes for all of the beasts of the jungles in the air just swarming over the RDA and kind of completely outnumbering them and outmaneuvering them. And it's very much the same kind of euphoric rush in pretty much exactly the same part of the film. If you kind of looked at the kind of the time code on each one, you'd have that those two events would occur pretty much exactly the same point in each story. And I find that it is fascinating.
Another thing I thought was really interesting was you mentioned how his dad does his own spirit quest, and during his one, he takes the form of I think as a cheetah or a leopard, who jumps into one of the one of the bulldozers and attacks someone. And I thought that image was fantastic because again, it's so similar to Jake when he wakes up and the bulldozer is like about to across crush them, and he's attacking the bulldozer immediately. And I thought that was again another one of those similarities which Cameron just reinterprets in a different way, because obviously he's taken these two characters and found a middle ground for them to create Jake Sully. And I think he's done a fantastic job of creating that middle ground to be like, okay, he's understanding the difference between his life and the life his son now leads.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. I think that's such a crucial moment in Avatar, because I think that's the moment that signals that Jake has fully planted his feet in the Almatikaya's camp. You know, that it's the moment where he kind of, it's the tipping point essentially. It's the point where physically aggresses against his own masters. You know, and I think that the whole way that scene is played is brilliant, because you've got him eating breakfast with with Grace and Norm in the shack, where the link pod is, and in his human body, and you've got Neytiri kind of absolutely freaking out because they're just about, they're both about going to get mashed by a bulldozer, and Jake's avatar body is asleep in the middle of the forest. And so you have this kind of hurried scene where he's trying to pack breakfast away as quickly as possible so he can dive back into the forest. And I mean, that tells you so much of where his heart really lies, because Jake, Grace is having to force him to basically eat breakfast to keep his human body going while he's linked up. And he just wants to get in there as quickly as he possibly can. And then when he wakes up, it's like, oh, you know I've got a job to do. And it's like he has almost like this kind of the his limbic brain, the kind of the primal part of his brain just goes you know completely goes ping. And he thinks, okay, I've got to bash this bulldozer with a rock. And I think that's when he kind of uncorks his own pent up aggression against all of the things that have been bothering him about his assignment.
Yeah, because that's like the first real sign that he's actually taken the step on along that line. Yeah, because he has been towing that line the whole way through the film. At that point, he is one foot in each camp, and now he's
he's
forced to
he's he's
make a
forced to
choice.
make a decision. Yeah, 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 and it's a brilliant set of circumstances. Dramatically, I think that Cameron picks in which to kind of signal that tipping point. Um, and it's brilliantly done as well in terms of how you got the cross-cutting back to what's going on in Hell's Gate, where you've got the dude who's in charge of the bulldozer, essentially by remote control, which is also kind of one of those things that sort of fills you with righteous indignation. This bulldozer is being driven by you know some jerk in an office, with with a kind of desktop joystick, and so there's that sense of the RDA's remoteness, their kind of physical and moral remoteness from what they're doing, and that they have got absolutely no connection with the importance of this sacred tree site that the bulldozer is ramming into. And at that point, when Jake wakes up in his avatar body and sees the bulldozer coming, he absolutely understands, the importance of the site. And it's where he spent the night after making love with Neytiri, and it's where they chose to you know connect their cues up to the tree, so they could commune with the ancestors and all this sort of stuff. And he understands how important it is, and sort of in the very fiber of his bones. And that's the point where he's had enough. And I think, yeah, probably in the Emerald Forest, that moment is where Markham goes on his own vision quest. That's also the moment where he slightly starts to turn against what he's been doing, and then he reaches his tipping point, his true tipping point, much more towards the end. I actually love the idea that that his explosives don't go off, you know.
Yeah, I think that's so fantastic, because it would have been such a. I feel like that's a Hollywood ending for the father sacrifices himself uh, in a dramatic explosion, but instead it is his choices ignored. He didn't have a choice in the end. You know, whatever he did, it wouldn't have mattered.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And instead of him being the guy who sort of makes this kind of heroic statement of a sort of an explosion, it's he ends up seeing that his son may have been right. All of this time. And that he he kind of gets the idea that it's a way of conveying to him how connected the tribe is with the natural world, and how detached his own community is.
So I think you made a really good point as well, which is to do with the way of water and
Yeah.
the fact that Spider and Tommy have seem to have some similarities.
Oh yes.
Now, obviously, we are. This is all speculation we're going to go into at this point.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I think there could be other things from the Emerald Forest which we could see into play in the Way of Water. And
Yeah.
one of the ones that I think might be most interesting is the idea of there being another clan who maybe not work together with the RDA, but
Yeah.
are take their side in a way.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we didn't see in the first one, because when Jake does his kind of whistle stop tour, and kind of rounds up local clans for the the kind of the big clash at the end, he that they all join him. He doesn't kind of have any pushback from any other clans, and we just sort of get the impression that the clans kind of work together, and that they're all sort of mutually and supportive. But I think that we're probably heading into a kind of a story where you know we end up with marriages of convenience, um, and that that there may well be clans who are prepared to sell out the Sullys. And I think that's going to be a really big deal, actually, um, because I think um, that probably needs to be introduced into the drama if you're going to be telling this larger story over 4 films, to have people kind of sort of swapping sides, and that kind of intrigue, I think is probably quite essential. So yeah, it will be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting aspect because obviously they can't just have it be the same story of, oh, the RDA are back, try to mine Onotanium or something else in this case.
I mean, it
Because
looks to me like the RDA is going to be coming after everything, because they're going to be building a city. So there's this place, Bridgehead, which is their new HQ. It, Apparently, it's gonna have a massive 3D printing factory that's going to be spewing out loads of weapons, and I just get the idea that they're going to come for everything. That they're going to need an awful lot of stuff to kind of substantiate all of that production, and to actually sort of build the city in the first place. And I mean, it looks like an enormous city, because of that very small shot of it that you get, the kind of the overhead shot of Bridgehead in the Way of Water trailer. There's a monorail. I mean, it's got like a kind of a public transportation system, which is something that Hell's Gate didn't have that. So this place is obviously going to be vast. So I think necessarily the RDA are going to have to probably cover an awful lot more territory. And I think there probably will be kind of bits of under the table, and probably even over the table kind of bartering going on. And yeah, that's that side of things. I mean, it's just one of those side of things. You can see it. You can see that it's got to happen. There's got to be that kind of that element of kind of intrigue and duplicity, sort of sewn into the sequels. But it's like, oh my god, this is going to be so painful.
absolutely, it feels like we're building up to a at some point there is not going to be a happy ending for one of these films.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
as you can imagine, because this is just how filmmaking works. You
yeah,
can't have all happy endings because otherwise you
yeah,
know what to
absolutely.
expect.
Yeah. I mean, Cameron has actually said, I think in the Empire interview, he said that that things do get really dark.
And to be fair, I trust Cameron. If he says it's dark, it's
Yeah,
gonna be
it's
dark.
going to be
He
really
doesn't
dark.
shy away. He'll push that like 12A rating to its limits. I can only
Yeah,
imagine.
yeah, yeah. Let's hope so.
Now, I did want to speak one other thing about Spider and sort of the relation to Tommy as a character, and especially that moment where Tommy sees his dad again for the first
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
I think, as you said with the teaser, it's very similar shot, and it
yep.
makes me again. This is once again a speculation thing. We
hmm
don't know who Spider's parentage is within the film. There has
I've
been
got I've got a
speculation.
slight idea what that might be.
Yeah, do you? Is this from like
Well,
just from discussions with other people?
not no, it's just from kind of just looking at the coverage essentially.
Hmm.
I mean, do you want me to voice my?
Oh, go for it. This is, everything we
I've
say
got
here, nothing is confirmed. We are
okay.
just
Yep.
speculating.
Well, I get the feeling that Quaritch is his dad.
This is what I thought as well. And I think it makes thematic sense in terms of, and I've got a feeling that shot of him pulling that bow and arrow, I think that's him facing Quaritch as in his avatar body. So I think that's, it's a shot for shot replica.
Yeah, it might be the case. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if it's the same kind of thing, father meets son, but it might be the case that Spider doesn't know that Quaritch is his dad at that point, and Quaritch doesn't know that Spider is his son at that point,
Absolutely.
because he might have had this kind of one night stand or something with a lady on the Hell's Gate compound, and then died before he actually realized what the the outcome of that was. And he's been brought up, Spider's been brought up by the Sullys. I mean, he might initially have been brought up for a little while by his mother, but at some point ended up being kind of adopted. But I mean, I don't know whether I haven't seen anybody listed in the cast who I think could be Spider's mother, so I don't know whether whether she's deceased by the time the story starts or something. But the idea that Spider would have been brought up by the Sullys, and you've got Quaritch, who's now in a an avatar body, a militarized version of an avatar body. I mean, the potential for some pretty deep drama is vast.
This is it. It feels like with the Way of Water, we've got so much potential in terms of which way this story can go, and there's so much speculation at the moment of what's going to happen, and it excites me in that sense that if we see stories like this play out, stories with Quaritch and Kira, and
The
it
Kira thing is absolutely fascinating. I
like
mean, it's I mean, it's almost like that having the kind of the Quaritch. I mean, assuming the Quaritch and Spider thing is an actual thing, right?
yeah,
I
this
mean,
is if it is a
yeah,
thing.
let's just assume for a moment that it is a thing. I mean, if we've got that as a thing, and then we've got this other thing, which is the Kira thing, which is the teenage Navi who is imbued with the potentially with the spirit and the soul of grace. I mean, this is cool stuff. you know,
Yeah, because it gets into all these ideas of like reincarnation and things like this, which is something like, wow, why we even how did Cameron even think to like want to cover this? But obviously, like he's got 4 films to talk all about these ideas, so why not just cover everything?
yeah, it's almost like he's deliberately putting into this one ideas that are weirder or slightly more. Um, sort of left field or kind of more dramatically challenging than what you have in the first one, because I think the first one is kind of very much set up along kind of lines of oppositionality. You've got the guys with the hardware, and then you've got the guys in the forest, and that there's that um uh, the brilliance of the film is that I think there was like 2 different design teams. So like one bunch of people handled all of the hardware, and one bunch of people handled all of the kind of Navi stuff. and then you've got, so you kind of you put that kind of clear blue water between those worlds, and so it's very much, it's kind of binary. It's sort of Avatar is very, it's got that kind of binary thing, and then the all of this stuff about, okay, well, we're going to maybe have this reincarnation thing, and we're going to have this, this father and son who don't know that they're father and son yet, kind of thing, potentially. It's a kind of it's eroding, and then also, if you add in, potentially clans who might not necessarily be on the side of the, the Sully family, you've got sort of an erosion of the barriers of oppositionality. You've got a kind of a breakdown of that binary thing, and it's kind of like more of a mix of competing interests. And which I think is probably, it's quite Game of Thrones like, in a way. you know um but I think that's really, that's an interesting direction to kind of push things in. um uh Following the kind of the quite sort of binary aspects of the first one, sort of have everything become a bit murkier.
Yeah, I think that's it. And I think, again, where I mentioned earlier about how Avatar feels like the prequel, it is the setup. It gets all the boring stuff out the way, in a way, of here's who your characters are, here's what the planet is. So now we could just get into the Way of Water and explore these ideas, which you could never do in not all these ideas in a singular film. And he's got 4 films to now explore so many different ideas that he's always wanted to do.
Yep, yep, absolutely. I think it's just an opportunity to kind of really kind of crack the world building open wide, because if you've got off on that brilliant foundation of the first one, which is, pretty rigorously detailed, in its own right. But there is the, the issue that it is, that, kind of the area of Pandora that we explore is very much, the kind of the immediate vicinity of where the Omaticaya live, and where they kind of, later, kind of retreat to after the attack on Home Tree. So you've got the opportunity to go a lot wider on the actual area in which this takes place. And obviously, if they're going to have to, the Sully family are going to have to break away at some point. I mean, I assume that, when we see the shots of them flying on their banshees down the coastline, in the trailer, I assume that by that point they're fugitives, and they seem like they're people who are escaping from something. And I mean, Jake doesn't look very happy.
Yeah.
When we see him, he's got that kind of brown, kind of cowl on, or that kind of shirt on, and he just looks very sort of haunted. um so yeah, I think that the, the whole idea of them having to range out a lot further, and to kind of get away from where they are, that is going to kind of lead us into a much wider approach to the world building.
Awesome. Is there any final thoughts you have on the Emerald Forest that you'd maybe suggest, maybe to convince people to explore it if they've had a listen and fancy it a little bit more now?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that it's an underrated film. It's a very mesmerizing film, actually. I think the combination of the visuals and the music. I mean, I think the music is fantastic. And if you're into stuff like, Michael Mann's Last of the Mohicans, you'll definitely love the Emerald Forest. It's got, actually, the two films have got a very similar vibe. So yeah, I'd say, it's a lost classic in a way. It's one of those films that I think should be brought up for reassessment, and I think a lot of people should pay a lot more attention to it. I mean, it's strange because John Boorman films, you've got John Boorman films that people just completely throw their weight behind, like Point Blank. I mean, Point Blank is like, everybody pretty much acknowledges that that's a classic, and it's always on, lots of best of lists. Um, and it's it absolutely exudes this guy's visual clout. He really knows what he's doing. But then there are other ones that are not quite as they don't have such good reputations, or they're not as sort of critically acclaimed. But I think the Emerald Forest really deserves to be thought of a lot. Sort of, I mean, it's not, it's not. I haven't seen much stuff that's kind of hugely directly negative about it, but it's kind of it's one of those it's one of those films that doesn't have a really big presence, and I think that it should have a much bigger presence than it does.
Yeah, I had a little look on Letterboxd, and I noticed that it had like only like 400 reviews, which is crazy to me. It's very low, and I was kind of shocked. I'll be honest though, before you brought it up to me, this isn't a film that I'd heard of, but I'm so glad that I've now visited it, and I've got a copy on DVD, which means I could just revisit it again and again. And I've got a feeling like post Way of Water, I'm going to watch it again because I've just got this feeling. I've got this feeling it's coming back. So if you're happy to post Way of Water, we will do a second episode of this and see what lays ahead. See if the Emerald
Sure, yeah,
Forest and
yeah.
Way of
See,
Water have a
yeah.
connection.
Let's see if Cameron has you know extracted more influence from the Emerald Forest as part of the sequels. Yeah, that'd be a fascinating it'd be fascinating to take a look at. Yeah, I'd love to come back anytime.
Of course, I do have a feeling though that if he does it again in the Way of Water, I don't think we'll be able to mine much more from it for 3, 4, and 5. He'll
Yeah.
probably run out of things to try. Yeah, so that's about it for us for this episode. Where's the best place for people to find you?
uh, at MJP Writer on Twitter, and yeah, come and say hi. If you're an Avatar geek who's looking for another Avatar geek to connect with, I'm right here.
And for me, best place to find us is Twitter at Avatar Pod. And it's been a pleasure having you on. Honestly, it's been such a
Thanks so
fantastic
much.
talk.
I've
This is.
loved it.
I feel like I've learned so much, and I've
Awesome.
now got such a long list of other films to explore for it, regards to the influences of Avatar.
Oh, fantastic.
But I mean, this is fantastic for me because I want to learn as much as I can.
Oh, well, I'm absolutely, that's made my day. Thanks so
Ah.
much.
So thank you everyone for having a listen. Catch you all again soon. Goodbye.